morning and welcome to Rising. We've got another fantastic show for you today. It is Wednesday and this feels like it's been kind of a long week.
There was a question mark at the end of it is Wednesday.
I can't believe this week is still going.
Yeah.
It's been a long one.
We're going to have a fun show. I didn't take my ADHD medication. We're in for a good one.
Oh, all right then. Well, let's get to it. Should be exciting. So we have a bombshell report related to Hunter Biden. Newly released records show that Hunter sought State Department help while his dad was vice president. New York Times reports that Hunter, acting on behalf of a Ukrainian energy company, Burisma, you probably know it by now, requested help from the U.S. Embassy in Rome, in Italy, for a potentially lucrative business deal. Now, Hunter wrote at least one letter to the U.S. ambassador to Italy in 2016 seeking assistance for Burisma, the Ukrainian gas company where Hunter sat on the board. Now, the officials seemed uneasy with Hunter's request and wrote back, quote, "This is a Ukrainian company, and purely to protect ourselves, USG should not be actively advocating with the government of Italy without the company going through the DOC Advocacy Center." A lawyer for Hunter told the Times that Hunter's request was proper and, quote, "No meeting occurred, no project materialized, no request for anything in the U.S. was ever sought, and only an introduction in Italy was requested."
Now, these records were FOIA requested, and the Biden administration withheld them for years. The State Department records were released to the New York Times only after Joe Biden ended his 2024 re-election bid. A White House spokesman told the Times President Biden was unaware that his son was reaching out to the U.S. Embassy in Italy on behalf of Burisma while he was vice president. As a reminder, Hunter will stand trial next month on charges related to evading taxes from Burisma and other foreign businesses. It's worth noting, that Hunter has not yet been charged with violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act. He may be one step closer. The act requires people to disclose when they lobby the U.S. government on behalf of foreign interests. But last week, in a court filing related to Hunter's California felony tax fraud case, prosecutors indicated they have evidence that Hunter reached out to the State Department on behalf of a different foreign client, this time a Romanian businessman who is facing corruption charges.
So we're talking about Rome and Romania.
Rome and Romania.
Different things here. There's a lot to get into, a lot to unpack. This is wild. So Hunter, while his father was vice president, Hunter, on behalf of Burisma, contacted the U.S. ambassador there in order to arrange a meeting with the governor of the Tuscany region because Burisma wanted to do some kind of business deal there. These are our ancestors, our people, right? Oh, you gotta show me the respect to build the energy company.
What would Mussolini say? The merging together of the foreign corporation and the state? What is this?
Amazing.
Global fascism.
So that sounds very corrupt. It's true that nothing came of it. Yes. Still showing some bad judgment on Hunter Biden's part. Clearly, the U.S. ambassador thought it reflected bad judgment because he wrote back to the vice president's son very frankly, this sounds sketchy, let's not. Now, the timeline of this being disclosed is also interesting. The Times had sought these kinds of records for a while. The State Department did not produce them. That could be for a variety of reasons. If I've engaged with the FOIA process before, it's a nightmare. You have to have exactly the right search criteria. It costs a lot of money on you to do it. It takes time. You don't get the records you want. The New York Times, according to this story, had sued the State Department because they were dissatisfied with their responses. And now, shortly after Joe Biden drops out of seeking re-election to the presidency, oh, here you go, here are the records, which they say, the Times says, could be a coincidence. These things get scheduled, these releases, long time in advance. But even the Times notes in its story, which is a pretty good story, by the way, that will not satisfy people. The coincidence of the timing will not go unremarked upon.
It is crackhead behavior to just be like, I'll call Italy up. Let's see what they say about this deal. Also very funny of this Ukrainian energy company. Can you imagine the board discussing potentially tapping Hunter Biden for a position? Let's get the vice president's drug-addicted son to do this work with us. He'll for sure say yes, because they will do a lot of things for money.
Yeah.
And he has power. how ridiculous to just send a letter and be like, hey guys, can you help us out?
I know.
Obviously, there was some tone of this, like, I'm the vice president's son, so it's in your interest to help me out. And thank God it was flagged as something that was suspicious, because can you imagine if they played ball with him?
Yeah. I think this did not come out already. We might not have learned about this at all, I guess, if Biden had just continued running for a re-election. I know we don't know that for sure, that the timing is like, well, it doesn't matter now, so we might as well not get ourselves in legal jeopardy and actually release the records. This makes more of a case for charging Hunter Biden with violating the Foreign Registration Act. If you're lobbying on behalf of a foreign government, you have to register, and he didn't. Lobbying on behalf of the Ukrainian government. Again, should point out, Donald Trump was impeached over some of his conduct relating to, for the first time, the wanting an inquiry into Biden-Ukrainian business dealings. It was a little bit more complicated than that. So this was made into a major national political issue. The president at the time was impeached over it. No evidence Joe Biden knew about what Hunter was doing, but still very bad judgment on Hunter's part. I wonder if there will not be repercussions for it. Again, we just have to keep in mind the tremendous gaslighting that went on from everyone who was defending Hunter in the media over the last few years in terms of, oh, the laptop versus the laptop's nothing. This is all, this is a Russian plant. It's made up. Well, no, it's actually true. It reflects, there's a lot of interesting information in here. Draw your own conclusions, but it is true. The influence peddling is now so well substantiated. The idea that he tried to involve his father in his schemes is clearly substantiated, that he was trading on his father's name. Yes, I agree. There is no evidence so far that Joe Biden participated in that. He was not a willing participant. He didn't know he was calling in or who he was being introduced to at that dinner or when he appeared on the phone. But Hunter was clearly trying to rope him in to these very corrupt-seeming schemes, and he should face accountability for that. Not accountability for buying a gun when he was addicted to drugs, which is the charge he faced. That's a very silly charge compared to lobbying on behalf of a foreign government, trying to get our government to do things on behalf of his business relationship because he's connected to the vice president.
Is it a foreign government or a foreign company? Right, the Ukrainian energy company is privately owned, but I think
Ukraine, it's.
I think that. It's crazy to me that that's a thing that's legal, that you can say in the United States of America, it's okay to lobby U.S. officials on behalf of a foreign company, which sounds like corruption, but it's not. You just have to get your corruption permit, and then it's okay for you to do. That's a key takeaway from this story, is that this wouldn't have been against the law if he registered as a foreign agent. Then all of this would have been okay. I think it's time for a lot of people to reconsider how our government works.
I'm not sure all of it would have been okay, but he would have protected himself from the accusation that he's corrupt. He's doing something counter to.
It definitely
US
would have tipped people off to
interests.
look into this sooner.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is something Republicans will get all over this. Republicans have been holding James Comer, all these oversight committee hearings, trying to find something tangible that links Hunter, that involves Joe Biden in this, and they failed. They've not really done a tremendous job. Lots of over-promising and under-delivering. So kudos to the New York Times for getting at long last the actual documents, and from the Biden administration, now that Joe Biden is no longer seeking re-election, it was time to let us all in on the big secret. More Rising right after this. All right, Jess, what are you writing in your journal?
Well, Robby, Elon Musk, in his conversation with Donald Trump on X Spaces, said something that has economists, financial experts, and really anyone who understands money pulling our hair out. Take a listen.
A lot of people just don't understand where inflation comes from. Inflation comes from government overspending because the checks never bounce when it's written by the government. So if the government spends far more than it brings in, that increases the money supply. And if the money supply increases faster than the rate of goods and services, that's inflation.
Yes, Elon, the U.S. economy is actually very simple. Thank you for that. It's just like how I ate ice cream while at the beach this weekend. Ice cream that had sprinkles on it, and now I have a sunburn, and that is because eating ice cream with sprinkles on it causes a sunburn. Maybe, to a child that doesn't understand the sun yet, that would be a convincing argument, and that is how Elon Musk sounds to people who pay attention to inflation and the economy. By the way, numbers out today show that inflation has fallen below 3%, the first time the rate was this low since 2021. But dudes like Elon are the reason I studied economics at all. My dad was a carpenter, and when the housing market crashed, thanks to risky decisions by greedy bankers trying to turn money into more money by just moving it around, we struggled to keep our home. My dad built homes from scratch with his own two hands for a living, and Wall Street was bailed out in the billions, but we nearly lost our home. To me, that didn't make sense. I wanted to figure out why our economy works like that and why people in power let it happen. Elon doesn't make much sense here either, because what he says just doesn't match with the data. So let's see precisely what the data shows. In June of 2022, we saw inflation reach 9%. That is a rate that is 3 times higher than it was when Biden first took office. When we compare the first quarter of 2020 to the rate of inflation in 2022, we also find that it was over 5 times higher in Lithuania, Ireland, Finland, Belgium, Denmark, Estonia, and over 10 times higher in Portugal, Spain, and Italy, and over 20 times higher in Greece and Israel. So, how did Joe Biden pull that off? Saying Joe Biden and the U.S. Congress, by authorizing spending via financial stimulus legislation, caused global inflation would be like if when I went back home to Iowa and I saw that my flower garden was flooded and I got mad at my boyfriend for overwatering the soil, and then I noticed our neighbor Mark's garden is flooded too, and so is our other neighbor Pearl's, and actually so is everyone's garden in the entire neighborhood, because it turns out he didn't overwater the flowers in our yard. It rained today. At the beginning of the pandemic, supply chains broke down and many people got sick. Bosses adopted social distancing guidelines in their warehouses and factories and packing plants so that their workers didn't all catch COVID and slow output of goods even further. The results of this and policies like this was decreased supply and higher prices. Remember how the shelves looked during the first year of the pandemic? It's not that. The American Rescue Plan was signed, and then the American people, with their extra cash, could finally splurge on toilet paper and SpaghettiOs. That's not to say it's impossible for the U.S. government to overspend. It's just not what caused inflation. I do not believe the U.S. government can put an infinite amount of dollars into the economy without consequences. It's important where the money goes, how much is spent, and when. That is why economists measure inflationary conditions. For example, the output gap. That is a measure for the difference in aggregate demand, or the total demand for goods and services in our entire economy, and the productive capacity of our economy. And that measurement is to make sure that we aren't in a position where too many dollars are chasing too few goods. Now, critics of the American Rescue Plan claimed that it would be too much spending and it would create a positive output gap. Too many dollars chasing too few goods, that would lead to inflation. The economists who warned of inflation saw this, the output gap, as the empirical test for overspending. And at the end of 2020, the output gap was negative. At 4%, still, by the end of the third quarter of 2021, it remained negative at about negative 1.7%. So this is even as inflation jumped up considerably. The spending did not create a scenario where too many dollars were chasing too few goods, as Elon Musk said happened. This is just a fact. When the output gap is positive, too many dollars are chasing too few goods. The source of the problem, though, it's not always on the demand side. We focus maybe too much on blaming the too many dollars portion as the source of inflation. Sure, the government can mess up the economy by adding too many dollars, but they can also mess it up by making policy decisions that reduce supply, the too few goods problem, might be overlooked. In an inflationary period, people overanalyze government spending, even when the data shows it's not the cause. People discuss taking away dollars through taxes, halting government spending and public programs, and reducing wages. That would all be reducing the demand for goods and services, the dollars chasing them. But they overlook the other half of the equation. They could increase supply of goods and services. If banks and investors aren't loaning as much money out to people who will invest in existing businesses or people who will start new ones, we will see a reduction in supply. The US government can always step in and make investments on the supply side. They could start with something we aren't producing very well now and something there's high demand for, like computer chips, for example. This kind of government spending prevents recessions. And for some reason, despite the multiple financial collapses in my lifetime, people don't get scared when banks are tasked with deciding when and how dollars enter the economy. That's insane to me, because while in my lifetime I've experienced multiple financial collapses thanks to the risks taken by Wall Street, the US government has never defaulted on a treasury bond payout. Elon's criticism of the government is that they overspent to cause inflation. Meanwhile, Trump added $7.8 trillion to the debt, but we didn't see high inflation under Trump. And what did the government do to contribute to inflation? Not overspend, like Elon said. And to be clear, it was not Joe Biden. It was the Trump-appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. The Fed intentionally constrained supply. Since the 70s, productivity has increased by 64.7%. Workers' pay has only increased by 14.8%. I cannot stress enough how insane it is that the people who use their own hands to do the work to keep our economy running are not compensated fairly for it. Again, it didn't used to be this way. We can look at how things changed over time. Look how much smaller of a slice of the pie workers are getting over time since the 1950s. Again, they're not being paid less because they're being less productive. They're exponentially more productive. This is hourly productivity since 1950. Again, compare that to today. In America, we believe this thing, that if you work harder, you do better, not worse. These two metrics of productivity and pay should increase in tandem. Something is terribly broken in our economy, and the people in charge refuse to fix it because at a time when wages had been stagnant for 50 years and workers are being more productive than ever before, Jerome Powell said workers are the problem.
People can get paid well. It's too hot. You know, it's unsustainably hot, but notwithstanding that, it's a very, very good labor market for workers. And it's our job to get it into a better place.
Jerome Powell decided to raise interest rates. That means it will be more expensive to get a loan because businesses will have to pay a higher percent of it back to the bank. So less people will start businesses and invest in existing ones. They'll hire less and lay off staff. There will be less jobs, and workers will be willing to take jobs for lower wages and less likely to ask for additional benefits, knowing they can be easily replaced, and wages, therefore, will go down. They could have, instead, increased supply if they thought demand was too high, but they never approach it that way. Instead, the plan is usually to make working people poorer.
Chair Powell, if you hit your projections, do you know how many people who are currently working, going about their lives, will lose their jobs?
I don't have that number in front of me. I will say it's not an intended consequence.
But it is, and it's in your report, and that would be about 2 million people who would lose their jobs. People who are working right now, making their mortgages.
Make people unemployed on purpose. But Elon won't talk about that because he's a billionaire. And this kind of policy benefits people who like wages low so their profits can be high. Interest rates have also contributed to inflation. Corporations can more easily afford high interest rates compared to small and medium-sized businesses. So while many mom and pop shops struggle, corporate profits are at a record high. They have less competition they can set prices even higher, and they have. In 2020, corporate profits were at $2.4 trillion. At the end of 2023, $3.2 trillion. Just for a visual, look here. This is what corporate profits after taxes have looked like since 1960. For the past 30 years, only 11.4% of money made off of price increases went to corporate profits. During the pandemic, 53.9% of money made off of price increases went to corporate profits. Input costs only increased 12% during the pandemic. So this was not caused by a higher cost of doing business. The 30 years before the pandemic, 62% of money made off of price increases went to workers' wages. During the pandemic, only 8% did. Now, inflation is a measure of price changes over time. If corporations, who now have a greater market share, are raising prices because they want to increase profits, that is literally measured as inflation. While companies are raking in profit, they don't want to use their own money to invest in growth. They'd rather do stock buybacks and increase returns to shareholders. They'd rather not take on loans they'd rather take on loans than reinvest their profit. But because of the high interest rate environment, that capital to invest in businesses came at a higher cost than they were willing to pay. So a lot of these companies started reducing the quality or the quantity of their products, but selling them for the same price. But now they would have lower input costs. Companies also like showing growth on their quarterly reports, but again, when interest rates are high, they don't want to invest more in creating a product of higher value. So they didn't, and increased prices anyway for the same exact stuff. But don't take my word for it. Here's John Castimedes, who's the president of 2 supermarket chains. He's also an oil and real estate CEO.
You know how CEOs are on Wall Street. They live quarter by quarter. If they're off by a penny in earnings, Wall Street is not forgiven. So what are the CEOs doing? They're raising prices.
They were saying the quiet part out loud through this whole thing. On a balance sheet, revenue increases from higher prices looks like growth, and that satisfies Wall Street investors. But for consumers at the store, it means higher prices. It means struggling to feed your family. And at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it is inflation. If the high interest rates are good for companies' balance sheets, things should be good on Wall Street, right? Why did the stock market go haywire on Monday of last week? Well, high interest rates are good for a key actor in our economy, the banks. Not Burbank. My family lives in a tiny house in rural North Carolina, and my parents live off of Social Security. Banks that loan money out and make money off of interest payments. They have been doing quite well. They rake it in during high interest rate periods. Banks also take the money and turn it into more money through investments. That's important because now that we are years into interest rate hikes, we're also seeing the real impact of slow job growth. The jobs report in July showed 114,000 jobs were added to the economy, which is much less than people expected. This means the Fed could say mission accomplished, and then interest rates will come back down. That would mean less money coming in for banks and less investment going out. The banks may no longer be bolstering the stock market, so people freaked out. And it's annoying that the economy is only considered bad when rich people have a harder time turning their money into more money without doing any work whatsoever, but that's how it is. So, at the onset of the pandemic, when the forecast for investment was uncertain, financial stimulus prevented a recession. You need money to make money. No one's going to wake up and go to work for $0. You have to pay workers, buy land, machinery, and tools to produce goods and services, to grow the economy. The dollars have to come from somewhere. If not banks or investors, the public sector can put dollars into the economy without it being inflationary. The government investing capital in things like revamping infrastructure was a good move. It prevented stagnation in the economy. It prevented a recession. Billionaires like Elon Musk just get mad when economic policy making for a brief moment benefits the economy as a whole. not just the ruling class of investors, owners, and executives. After all, he knows himself that government spending isn't always inflationary and is sometimes good and productive. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken a $465 million loan from the government in 2010 or taken in $9 billion in revenue from the carbon credit program. But don't take advice from the economy from anyone who's had a vested interest in working people getting paid less or paying higher prices. Elon and I can agree on one thing.
A lot of people just don't understand where inflation comes from.
Agree that Elon Musk might not understand where inflation comes from.
I mean, does he not, though? So you agree that government spending can contribute to inflation sometimes.
It can, but it didn't. And the real constraints
in 2022?
Right.
I mean, I think most analyses conclude that it did. I'm reading one from MIT from, this is not my area of expertise, clearly, so I'm just looking for high-quality sources. Mark Kritzman of MIT writes that 40% of inflation in the 2022 spike specifically was attributed to government spending. It was by far the most likely explanation.
They have no way of calculating that. There's no way of knowing where price increases come from. You can't interview a CEO and say, why are you raising prices? Oh, it's because there's more dollars in the economy because the government overspent. There's a human decision maker at every corporation that says, yeah, we're going to raise prices. When you have the federal government,
obviously the people who literally decide what the price is are, I guess, the most, but
I am talking about the root cause.
Okay, but the analysis is that they did that because of the government spending.
No. So when you have the U.S. government decreasing supply, that's a key factor in the equation of increased demand. The United States government, if they're not investing dollars in having our economy at full productive capacity, if banks and businesses are not allocating loans towards growing our economy, then we can enter a situation where too many dollars are chasing too few goods, even without any spending. If it was the case that any additional dollars in the U.S. economy caused inflation, we would have seen rampant inflation under Trump when the debt was increased by over $7 trillion. We didn't see that. And so it does matter where the money goes. Spending money into the economy at a time when you're constraining supply can be inflationary, but they had no reason to constrain supply, and businesses could have been investing if it was a lower interest rate environment. So to slow the growth of the economy while adding additional dollars to it is an issue. A lot of the dollars that were added to the economy actually went to increasing productive capacity over time through things like the CHIPS Act and the American Infrastructure Bill.
All right, well, you let us know what you think about that. Viewers, we'll have more Rising right after this. After the assassination in Tehran of Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, the architect of the October 7th attack, was invited to peace talks in Doha Thursday. Hamas says that they will entertain what Israel has to say, but only after the talks. Simply a ceasefire is in limbo.
Meanwhile, the frequency and intensity of attacks between Iran-backed Hezbollah and Israel has had the region on edge. Iran has threatened to retaliate either through its proxy or directly. The threat is real enough that the United States sent ships and subs to the region just in case. So is the region on the brink of World War III? What does Hezbollah, which operates out of Lebanon and Iran, want? With us now to unpack all of this is David Dowd, a fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you for joining us, David.
Thank you for having me on.
So what do you make of the intensification of fighting between, Hezbollah, which is backed by Iran, and Israel? Do you see this breaking out into a wider regional war?
Not necessarily at this stage. Hezbollah began attacking Israel on October 8th with a kind of tipping their toe in the water manner. And they've intensified since then. There have been punctuations of intensification throughout the past 10 months. If the Israelis assassinate a specific commander, if Hezbollah crosses a red line, either side that finds itself on the receiving end will intensify the fighting. But I don't think either side right now wants a broader war. Hezbollah certainly does not want a broader war. Lebanon's economic collapse that began in 2019, it puts a lot of pressure on them in that regard. I think what they want to do is to redraw their red lines with the Israelis after the strike in Beirut, but thread that fine line between reemphasizing their limits, but not letting things escalate into a broader war.
So Hamas does not want to participate in these peace talks. So what are the odds that anything constructive then can even come out of them?
Well, what are the odds in general? We still don't know the terms exactly of the ceasefire talks and what that would entail. I think there are also positions that are perhaps unbridgeable between the Israelis and Hamas. The Israelis remain steadfast in their commitment to dismantle the organization militarily and as a governing entity. And that's something that Hamas won't accept. I think the Israelis have the upper hand, so to speak, in bargaining, given the course of the war. But Hamas is holding out. We'll see how things play out. But I'm personally not very optimistic that a ceasefire will emerge from these talks on Thursday.
Do you see the assassination as the key factor that derailed the ceasefire talks, or do you see Bibi Netanyahu's unwillingness to arrive at a ceasefire, agreement as the main reason these talks are falling apart?
I see neither as the primary factor. Look, at the end of the day, Hamas has an objective to end this war prematurely. To achieve a ceasefire prematurely. This is the collective objective of the resistance axis. This is why Hezbollah entered the fight also on October 8th. They want to survive, as any entity would. But the problem with that is that they're not willing to survive and come to a permanent agreement with the Israelis, a permanent ceasefire, which would mean that Hamas accepts Israel's right to exist and would never attack Israel again in the future. What they're asking for is to be spared by the Israelis now, so that a nucleus of this organization, Hamas, can survive, rebuild, and prepare to attack Israel again in the future. And look, their leadership has said there are future October 7ths in store for the Israelis. I don't think that's something the Israelis can accept. I mean, imagine just a negotiation in 2002 or 2003 between the United States and Al-Qaeda, where Al-Qaeda's terms were, let us survive so we can do another 9/11 to you. I would consider that the primary impediment to things moving forward.
In the past, U.S. governments, administrations have put some pressure on Israel to not escalate matters further with its neighbors for the sake of our own security. The Biden administration hasn't really done that. We've heard occasional rhetorical dissatisfaction with the Israeli government expressed by Biden and his acolytes, but no real firm pressure, or at least not that we're aware of. It could be happening very secretly behind closed doors. If so, nothing has come of it. Is that going to change at any time? Obviously, we're in this transition point where we don't know if the next administration is going to be Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, and I don't think have a good understanding of how either of those individuals would handle the Middle East if it would depart meaningfully from what Biden has done. Do you have any reason to think there's going to be some change in course, that there's going to be either greater restrictions placed on Israel or pushed toward Israel from the U.S. perspective, or I guess potentially more permissivity?
So I actually do think that the Biden administration has placed a lot of brakes on Israeli military action. If you look at it purely militarily, vis-a-vis Hezbollah, for example, the reason the Israelis, despite having legal justification, I'd argue, for launching a broader campaign into Lebanon to stop Hezbollah's attacks, to distance Hezbollah from the border, to enforce the terms of Resolution 1701, which devolved primarily upon Lebanon to distance Hezbollah north of the Litani River, to disarm Hezbollah. This is something that Lebanon has proven unwilling and incapable of doing. And now we're at the stage where we are, where Hezbollah has launched 10 months of attacks unprovoked into Israel. The Israelis would have justification to broaden the campaign into Lebanon. The fact that they haven't, I think, is testament to the pressure that the Biden administration has brought to bear on the Israelis. There were halts of weapons shipments in early May, if we recall, the 2,000-pound bombs. There was also pressure on not beginning operations in Rafah. And, Rafah was on the table since December. The fact that the entry into Rafah only began in May, 5 months delay, I think was testament to the Biden administration's pressure to see deliverables from the Israelis on humanitarian aid, on ensuring that minimization of civilian casualties in any operation in Rafah. And I think we're continuing to see certain degrees of pressure. But look, at the end of the day, these are two independent countries that are going to function according to their interests. The United States can bring pressure on Israel to serve U.S. interests, broader U.S. interests in the region, and the Israelis, looking at things from across the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, are going to see things differently from their national security and their national interest perspective.
David, it does seem like they are independent countries when we consider Biden said it would be a red line if Israel were to have a ground invasion into Rafah. They conducted a ground invasion anyway. When Kirby was asked about this in press briefings, he said, we're not going to check Netanyahu's homework. What we're seeing there is not a ground invasion. We're seeing them conduct strikes. And so they kind of got off on a technicality with that, but it really seemed like Netanyahu was not listening to Biden, or Biden never made clear this was a red line in his conversations with Netanyahu. But moving forward, they have $3.5 billion additional dollars that were just authorized to Israel. If those dollars are used for additional strikes, potentially in Iran, in Lebanon, or more in Yemen, and now there's U.S. ships being sent to the Middle East, how could the U.S. get involved more directly if Netanyahu decides to use those weapons provided by the United States, American bombs, in a manner that brings other actors into the conflict rather than just Gaza and the IDF?
Look, let's start with the fact that it wasn't the Israelis that brought these actors into the conflict. The Houthis, the strike in Yemen happened after the Houthis launched. They have been launching attacks, again, unprovoked. There's no border with Israel. There's no real conflict with Israel. They launched a drone, the Jaffa drone, they dubbed it, into Tel Aviv, killing an Israeli citizen. As a sovereign country, Israel could not remain silent on that. Then again, with the escalation with Hezbollah, unprovoked attacks that began on October 8th that have continued since then. The recent strike in Beirut happened after 12 Israeli children were killed by an errant Hezbollah rocket. Countries have to draw red lines. I don't think the United States should get militarily involved. I don't think it serves anyone to have the United States militarily involved. The utility of Israel as an ally is that it is able to defend itself by itself. Yes, as the United States, we may provide them military support, we may provide them a degree of diplomatic support when we agree with their actions. But at the end of the day, I think it is most beneficial for Israel to be perceived in the region as able to defend itself by itself, and it does not help the United States to get involved. And I don't think the United States should come to Israel's rescue militarily by putting boots on the ground. And I don't think the Israelis want that.
David, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Morning Joe continues to fawn over Vice President Kamala Harris and her, quote, great ground game. Let's watch.
Something's happening now when lifelong Republicans are telling me that they and their daughters want to drive 4 hours to see a Kamala Harris, Tim Walz rally. But the key is, do those rallies, do those translate into votes? And there was a big question in 2016 whether those rallies translated into votes, because unlike Barack Obama in 2008, Donald Trump didn't really have a great ground game, right? I will say in 2024, Kamala Harris does have a great ground game because Jen O'Malley started building it for Joe Biden years ago. And that's what she's an expert at, and that's what they've been investing at. And you add that, and then David Plouffe and the other additions to the campaign, chances are good they're going to translate this sort of pop cultural moment into votes in November.
Meanwhile, the Harris campaign released a new ad touting her immigration record. Here's a clip.
Kamala Harris has spent decades fighting violent crime. As a border state prosecutor, she took on drug cartels and jailed gang members for smuggling weapons and drugs across the border. As vice president, she backed the toughest border control bill in decades. And as president, she will hire thousands more border agents and crack down on fentanyl and human trafficking.
Now let's take a look at Scarborough's reaction to that.
And that's exactly what you have to do. You go right in to the issue that your opponent thinks is your weakness, and you make it your strength. It's something that she's effectively done, Kamala Harris, on the campaign trail already. I suspect it's something that she'll effectively do also in the debate, because it's very simple. First of all, border crossings this summer lower than they were, of course, when Donald Trump was leaving the White House. And also the Langford bill, the most conservative border bill ever Kamala Harris supported. And all those things that she said in that ad she supported, Donald Trump actually stopped.
So the first thing that was said on Morning Joe by Scarborough that struck me is that Obama didn't have a ground game in 2008. I've worked in the field in presidential campaigns. I promise you, every single Democratic campaign's field office is modeling something they're doing after the organizing that Obama did in 2008.
That was what he said. I thought he said he did have a ground game.
I thought he said he didn't, and now we're seeing Kamala.
I thought he was
does.
saying Trump didn't have a ground.
I mean,
you're correct. Obama had one of the most impressive ground games ever.
I hope that's what he said, because if he didn't, that would be to misunderstand a huge chunk of Democratic politics.
Right.
But also rallies and ground game are very different things. Having organizers in field offices knocking doors and getting groups together to talk about how they're making a plan to vote, which increases turnout, that's a real ground game.
Right.
He's right to say these rallies might not translate.
Right. Ground game is, having enough activists in every state to go knock doors, distribute literature, register your people to vote. Mm-hmm. That's a little bit different than holding rallies, which are to gin up enthusiasm, are more for optics and appearances. If you're visiting the swing states and getting huge crowds of people when you speak there, that is some evidence that you're doing something right. But the ground game in terms of the nuts and bolts of campaigning is what's really important. Yeah, Barack Obama had the most successful operation in that regard ever. So I don't know that, I simply don't know if Kamala Harris is doing that well. I'm sure she's doing quite well. Republicans are, I think, doing better at this than they were in maybe the last two cycles, but whether it's enough remains to be seen.
Right. I think the rallies are people showing up who are already so intensely engaged with politics, people who are definitely going to show up to vote. It does energize them, maybe get them to donate, talk about it with their friends more who might not be engaged, but I don't think it really changes that much.
Yeah, it earns media attention, and media attention is worth something.
People
it's not
listening
everything.
To the speeches on news shows like ours.
Right. Trump, for instance, has always benefited from he gets so much free media that he doesn't have to pay for because he's just talked about in the media incessantly. Talked about in a negative way in most of the mainstream media, but talked about nonetheless, which contributed to him having like the highest name identification of anyone ever running for president who wasn't already the president. People had seen him on their televisions for years. They knew who he was. They felt close to him, and that bought him a lot of, that helped him earn a lot of votes without him having to introduce himself to the American people. Kamala Harris, and Joe Biden was, when he ran for president in 2020, he was not beloved by the media at all, but he was better known than the rest of the field because he was the sitting vice president. He was a little bit underrated, actually, because the media was like, well, he's not exciting, he's not progressive, he's an old white man. What do we have to even write about? But the American people already knew who he was. Kamala Harris is, I think, is somewhat known to the American people and is being reintroduced to them, and the media is doing everything they can to introduce her to the American people in a positive way, manifesting all of these positive pop culture vibes on her behalf that, like Obama, are worth something, but are not worth as much as having a competent ground game and having excited young people knocking doors and doing work on your behalf. Maybe she has that too. Maybe it's sincere. I don't know. I've been a little bit skeptical, but things are going pretty well for her campaign so far. It's very close right now. It could absolutely go either way. She very well could win on the strength of the campaign she's running right now. It will be extremely close.
Yeah, it's easy for young people to get excited about a candidate like Kamala coming after Joe Biden, someone who is more progressive than Joe Biden, more alive than Joe Biden. That support with the pop culture stuff, with Brat and all of the posting online, is organic. The media's response to that, where they're like holding up a printout of the Kamala HQ Twitter page, and they're like, look, the background's green. That means brat. What is brat? And instead of just getting someone who's Gen Z on to discuss this, a bunch of old dudes just talk about it and try and make sense of it. I don't think the media is helping her support among youth voters. And her popularity on the internet, I would say, is organic. Mainstream media is not helping that. Mainstream media.
I'm not all convinced that it's organic.
People like Scarborough saying, oh, this ad is so great of her on immigration. I promise you, 90% of the young people that are posting Brat Summer Kamala stuff are not happy that she's running to the right of Trump on immigration, which that ad was pretty much her saying, yes, I am. I was tougher on the border than Trump was. That is not going to be popular among progressives, and this idea that Trump is so far to the right that we're creating a big tent and capturing those votes, that's not necessary. You don't need to cater to Republicans.
I mean, you can say that. I don't know. I would argue, I mean, I don't want her to because I don't really want her to win, but you could argue that she should.
You think it's a winning strategy?
Kate, I think trying to win over, I mean, people, according to polls, immigration is the most important issue right now, and the public is they're to my right on immigration. The public is very much to the right on immigration. They're fed up with what's happening on the border. They want less immigration. They particularly want less illegal immigration. They want something done about it. So she needs to signal. I don't think she could win by running a very progressive, we need to open the border and it's all fine and we need to bring more people in, because that's not, yes, I understand that's popular with young people, but if it's between, I don't know, if it's between playing to a very progressive young people voter demographic or reassuring right-leaning, Trump skeptical, centrist-y type people in the swing states that she will be at least somewhat moderate or conservative on immigration, I would think that's the better strategy. But she doesn't have to take my advice. I'm not rooting for her.
Polling shows that the most popular policy among progressive policies that were polled for, 61% of likely voters support expanding Medicare. Cutting the cost of prescription drugs also very high. 64% of likely voters, Republicans included, support making the wealthy pay their fair share in taxes. She could be running on left-wing policies. She said yesterday she's not running on Medicare for all. She hasn't made a big statement about wealth taxes, so she could run on progressive policies and still be a popular candidate. And she's just choosing not to.
I hope she does that. I hope she promises. I hope she talks incessantly about raising taxes on people. That would be just wonderful. Please do that, Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
Love to see that. More Rising right after this.
Tim Walz was fiery at his first solo campaign event as Kamala Harris's running mate. The Minnesota governor defended his military record amid attacks from Republicans who have accused him of stolen valor.
I was proud to make it to Washington. I was a member of the Veterans Affairs Committee and a champion of our men and women in uniform. I'm going to say it again as clearly as I can. I am damn proud of my service to this country. And I firmly believe you should never denigrate another person's service record. To anyone brave enough to put on that uniform for our great country, including my opponent, I just have a few simple words. Thank you for your service and sacrifice.
Waltz has been under fire. Trump's campaign advisor, Chris Lasidka, who created the Swift boat attack campaign against one-time presidential candidate John Kerry, has lobbed attacks against Waltz's claim of service, including accusing him of quitting the Army National Guard so he wouldn't have to go to Iraq and exaggerating his service record. At the rally, Waltz made many appeals to working-class American families, and as we all know, the way to many people's hearts is through their stomachs.
I happen to be the first union member on a presidential ticket since Ronald Reagan. But rest assured, I won't lose my way. Probably should be a few more union members in elected office, President Saunders. We might want to work at that. I think I'm looking at some. So you heard the story. You knew Vice President Harris grew up in a middle-class family, picked up shifts at that McDonald's as a student. I keep asking this to make a contrast here. Can you simply picture Donald Trump working at a McDonald's trying to make a McFlurry or something? Oh, he knows us. He couldn't run that damn McFlurry machine if it cost him anything. So
what did you make of Waltz's defense of his military record? Was it satisfactory?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think it's possible to defend. I think he did exaggerate his record, that he suggesting, as I've said many times, that he served in combat, that he carried weapons in war, meaning warfare, when he didn't. And I think he made that implication. I also think it's pretty clear that he got out of his unit just before it was going to be deployed to Iraq, and conservatives are, making a lot about this. I think it's fair to criticize him over it because that was the implication he put out there, and the right is going to continue to hammer him on this, whether it's the most important issue ever. No, what I really don't like about him is his big government liberal policies and the utter tyranny he presided over in his state during COVID, the appalling business climate he created in Minnesota, and so many other things. I find him thoroughly unlikable and frankly terrifying, and I find him way more dangerous than Kamala Harris, but it's up to voters to decide.
Yeah, I was in elementary school when John Kerry was running. I don't remember the Swift boat thing, but I heard it was bad.
It was bad.
And despite the claims being debunked, it still hurt his campaign. Like, Waltz was in service for 24 years before he ended up retiring. He was 41 years old, and he decided that he was going to retire before they got their deployment orders. He filed to run for Congress before they even knew that they would be considered as a unit to deploy to Iraq, and they said it would happen over the next 2 years. He said, I'm willing to serve our country, whether it's in Washington, D.C. or it's in Iraq. He said many times that he deployed during the war in Afghanistan in support of the war, which is very precise language. And so, yeah, I think even though there's not a lot of merit to the attack against him, we know from John Kerry's campaign that actually doesn't matter for it to hurt his candidacy. I think it would matter more if he was top of the ticket than if he was vice president, and if he said this more times than just this once, where he said, I carried weapons in war.
Yeah, I mean, we've argued about this a number of times and will continue to do so, but he has really been a focus of the Trump campaign, or the media conservative people right now. Honestly, much more so than Kamala. He's been more front and center, or he has more of a record to scrutinize. Kamala, maybe this is an advantage she has, that I really don't know what she thinks or what policies she wants to advance. I don't know what kind of ideology she has. She's not making that clear. She has to share in the Biden policy. She's been part of the Biden administration for 4 years, but they feel more like Biden's policies than hers. Now, I think she's certainly responsible for them and on the hook for them, but maybe it feels like less that there's a record to go over with her. We have to go back to her, Senate record, which was extremely progressive, extremely to the left, in my view. Whereas Tim Walz, by contrast, has been the governor, the chief executive of a state for a period of time. We can see much more directly which policies he supported that include all the things I went over during COVID, the mandates, the lockdowns, the snitch hotline for people. Actually, I recently saw an interview on Fox with maybe we can do a segment on this later, with a woman who was I believe fined and maybe even jailed under the COVID policies in Minnesota for having violated the social distancing rules. That was not a common occurrence, but it did happen. So that's the kind of thing that I expect conservatives, and rightly so, to make a big deal out of.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tim Walz and Kamala Harris are going to have to run on bread and butter issues. They're going to have to run on expanding Medicare. They're going to have to run on making the wealthy pay their fair share of taxes when they're contributing to Social Security and retirement. That's a huge reason Social Security is in threat of being insolvent. Of course, that would never happen. We've had many chairmen of the Fed say that it's actually not possible to default on the money going towards Social Security, and we would just allocate the dollars to the account. And the real constraint to that would be whether or not there's goods and services for the people receiving Social Security to purchase. And we're not at a place where we believe that will happen. But if the wealthy had been paying their fair share into Social Security, it wouldn't be in threat. We wouldn't have people on the right.
Their fair share? Wealthy people are paying millions
paying
of dollars.
the same margin that working class people do.
They pay more money as a real amount, but they pay more actual money.
That doesn't matter. They pay a lower margin. They should pay the same margin as the working class of America. She also proposed a cap on rent increases. All of these policies I've listed have a 53% or above polling average among people
rent control
who are likely voters.
Rent control
a cap on
leads
rent
to
increases. That's different
shortages.
from rent control.
Yeah, that would be the most dramatically bad thing we could do to alleviate our housing crisis, would be to start putting caps or controls on what people are allowed to pay for. We need
but that's not
more availability. Okay, go ahead.
It's the rent cap is you can't raise rent 5% or more over 2 years for all corporate landlords. So these are only applying to people who have 50 or more units.
Yeah, that's how we'll get housing shortage. Look, I do hope they run on these utterly failed, inane, left-wing, progressive economic ideas that will impoverish our country if implemented. Tim Waltz, you're right, has a long track record of supporting those, and I hope attention is called to them.
Yeah, they're insanely popular. They will win votes. I think it's a big issue that, by global standards, the United States is so far to the right that Kamala Harris is running on immigration policies that are very far to the right. Her not supporting Medicare for all makes her a right-wing candidate by any other modern country's standards.
What do you mean she doesn't support it? She voted for it when she was a senator.
No, she didn't.
Didn't she?
No. She is against Medicare for all.
I believe she was for it.
Running for.
Well, you're right. Maybe she's not. This is my confusion about her. I don't know if she supports it or not. Right. Now she said no, but when she was in the Senate, she supported it.
I know that
did.
She went back and forth on her presidential campaign in 2020 as to whether or not she supported it. It would be rich if she voted for it in the Senate, but then didn't run on it as president. And I think her coming out and saying we're not going to push for Medicare for all is ridiculous. It's one of the most popular common sense policies. We're paying more for health care than anywhere else in the world in the United States. And she's just like, nope, not going to run on that. So the Democrats and Republicans are very far to the right by global standards. And even though, even her running on these top 5 progressive policies that are popular, we would still be to the right by standards of modern Western nations around the world.
Right. I think conservatives say we're to the right, which is why we're a much more wealthy, successful, affluent country than places that create crippling regulations on businesses and welfare states so robust that people don't want to work or innovate, and that's why we have more access to material wealth, not just for the wealthy, but for everyone.
I think anyone can look at a map and see why we have material wealth. We have a much bigger nation with much more natural resources than other countries.
Yeah, that's part of it.
That's what makes us a wealthy country.
And also that we have, there's no tech, we talked about this yesterday, there's no tech sector in Europe because they want to regulate tech to death. We allow people to come here and to work and build things, and we tax them reasonably, so they have to pay back something, so that we create some standard of protections for people who are not well off, and that's the system most Americans want. They want one where people don't just get handouts, they don't just get the government taking care of them, but there's some reasonable protections, and then people have to, create something for themselves and find their place in the economy, and it seems to work pretty well.
I think working people who are now paid less and have less purchasing power with their dollars than they did in 1968 by 34% are saying that it's not working for them. And I think that's why Kamala Harris and Waltz are popular.
We'll see if they're popular. All right, more Rising right after this. Whoopsies, the Harris campaign was caught red-handed editing news headlines and descriptions within Google search ads that make it look like CNN, CBS, Reuters, The Guardian, and other major news organizations are on her side. This is according to Axios. Now, to be fair, it's not strictly against Google's policies and is a common practice in the commercial advertising space. The ads are also labeled as sponsored. Still, when you look at them, it's not clear that the text accompanying the real news links was actually written by the campaign rather than the news organization listed there. Now, Axios reports that the Trump campaign is not running these types of ads, though the same technique has been used by other campaigns in the past. Interestingly, Facebook banned this practice back in 2017, saying it was part of its efforts to stop the spread of misinformation. Spokespersons for USA Today, CNN, and NPR told Axios they were unaware their brand was being featured this way.
Now, the author of the Axios article, Sarah Fisher, tweeted, quote, Harris camp doing nothing wrong, and Google, which is pretty strict about banning spammy ads, doesn't see it as a consumer harm. News outlets just collateral damage in this weird ads tactic. To which Glenn Greenwald responded saying, quote, I was shocked yesterday when I saw Axios publish an investigation reflecting negatively on Kamala's campaign. But soon as the reporter, Sarah Fisher, was attacked for doing it, she immediately denigrated her own scoop, saying it was no big deal and Kamala did nothing wrong. So yes, it's legal. I'm curious.
Well, of course it's legal, and it's not counter to, it would be legal even if it violated Google's policies.
My sense is you just shouldn't be able to edit a headline at all, even if it's representative of the truth, which, you know, it seems like they were an example of how she changed them. The Guardian shows a headline that reads, VP Harris fights abortion bans, Harris defends repro freedom. And the actual story was something similar, like VP Harris is a champion for reproductive freedom. An ad featuring the link to the NPR story, you know, it says Harris will lower healthcare costs. I think that, yes, there are stories that have come out with similar headlines, and changing them to be more brief and slightly more favorable, yeah, it's a little bit weird, it's unnecessary. It's not as egregious as Elon Musk recently posting a Telegraph article that's just blatant disinformation and doesn't resemble a headline that ever actually existed. But it's just a silly practice.
Well,
no
is Elon
campaign
Musk
should
running
be...
for president? That's the standard? If Elon Musk did something worse, it's okay?
No,
it's ridiculous.
That's not what I'm saying. I already said no one should edit a headline. I am saying there is a difference in putting blatant misinformation, saying Keir Starmer's putting people in detainment camps, and saying NPR wrote a story that said a Harris presidency would reduce healthcare costs. Those are different.
Yeah. Fine, they're different. Although, as I pointed out yesterday, you can respond to that post if Elon or anybody else on X gets something wrong. You can community note it to death, as did happen in that case. This is on Google Ads, where there's no such on Google, where there's no such function. She made it look like, you know, if you're saying that the original headlines are similar enough, then just leave them alone. She made it look like that was perspective coming from the news outlets when really was perspective coming from the campaign. And I say she made it look like that. I don't know. You know, she is not personally responsible for what happened here. Someone in the campaign did that. It's very bad. It's just a deceptive, you know, it's a kind of routine, somewhat deceptive practices that happen in political advertising that is par for the course. Do I think it's the biggest deal ever? Certainly not. Do I think, you know, it's a crisis that people are being lied to this way and they're being, you know, their minds are being manipulated? No. But this is the kind of dramatic language by which the other side, by which the mainstream media, misinformation watchdog people describe every single thing that is even slightly deceptive on the right. They describe it as, you know, how can we even have democracy or fair elections if the other side is allowed to do, or, you know, slightly deceptive things? But like this, the game is being played by Democrats and Republicans. This is a good example of that. And I just think the whole misinformation framing has been so blown out of proportion. Now, when people say, mainstream media people, this is misinformation, that is misinformation, often this is just an opinion they don't agree with that is part of the legitimate debate. This term is just losing all meaning very rapidly. Now, anything you don't like is misinformation. Like, show me on the doll where the misinformation touched you. It's getting to that level of hysteria. And it's just done on both sides. But like all campaigns use somewhat deceptive practices. This is a somewhat deceptive practice. It's not the biggest emergency ever, but neither is a lot of the stuff done on the right.
Yeah,
is what I would say.
I think that's the right perspective. I mean, the right does that all the time too, though, and that's why I don't like either party, because they compromise their own values and morals when it's their team doing it. So I don't think the right accuses the left of this more or the left accuses the right of this more. They both, at their political convenience, accuse the other of whatever makes them look better and the other side look worse. There's never any logical consistency to it. It's like when Donald Trump was assassinated and suddenly Don Jr. and other right-wing commentators did believe that rhetoric could cause violence.
Yeah, that was really
a complete 180.
I called that out
saying in the past.
Unreservedly. I thought that was totally stupid.
Yeah. And so I think that, yes, this should never happen. There should never be a headline attributed to a major news organization that is not one that they have written or their editors have written.
Yeah.
I think that, bottom line, shouldn't happen. Of course it has, and our elections are really messy in the United States, but I think now that there's attention to it, Google should take action and just decide, we're not going to let that to be put in ads. But it is probably a process that doesn't have as much oversight as it should at Google. A lot of people run ads for their small businesses. Maybe bigger ad buys like ones for the Harris campaign have more oversight, but I imagine there's quite a lot on down ballot races that would slip through the cracks there.
Yeah, by the way, we reached out, Rising did, to Sarah Fisher, that reporter, and did not hear back. I think Glenn's point is well taken, that she actually had a pretty good scoop that, again, is a minor point of something bad the Kamala Harris campaign did, and she is falling over herself to acquit Kamala Harris of any wrongdoing. Like, what are you, people are going to say this is more evidence of how just in the tank for Kamala mainstream media organizations are, that even when they have a good scoop, they want to undermine their own reporting so as not to, maybe so as not to make Kamala Harris's team mad at them because they're hoping for exclusives and all that sort of stuff later. That's an issue. That's something I always appreciate about the outlet we work for, The Hill. No matter how, I've never gotten any pushback, no matter how critical of the Biden administration or Trump or any, how critical we are of political people, no one at The Hill is ever saying to us like, oh, we're seeking access. You got to shut up about that, which is something I imagine happens at a lot of other outlets.
I will say, any candidate that is running center-right, protecting corporations, fighting for the military-industrial complex to stay untouched, these are all candidates that the mainstream media has always liked, because the mainstream media has corporate advertisers and is run by corporate shareholders who have a vested interest in having the stock market remain intact, profit margins high, so return to shareholders are high. It's always in that interest. If Harris said tomorrow, I'm going to fight for Medicare for all, suddenly she wouldn't be a darling in the media. So it really has nothing to do with her personally or the Democrats, but that she is very willing to play this role of being a centrist who culturally panders to movements that are positive for women in the LGBTQ plus community while ultimately being a pro-military industrial complex corporate candidate.
Yeah, I think she would get praised by the media if she came out for Medicare for all.
No, she wouldn't.
As she did previously. She would get praised if she came out against it. I think she'd get praised if she ate a ham sandwich. I think no matter what her policy prescriptions are or what she does, she will be praised by progressive media as long as she doesn't become like anti-woke.
Progressive media and mainstream media are not the same thing. Mainstream media is not progressive.
As
soon as Kamala Harris came out and said she's for taxes on tips, there were articles about how that wouldn't work. Same policy.
Really? Where? Really? No. What there were is, so when Donald Trump came out, we might just be describing different media organizations. I take your point. I wasn't talking about left people. Left publications, I know, are actually committed to I disagree with their principles, but they're committed to their principles. And sure, they will criticize Kamala Harris for policy failures on the left. I agree with you there. I didn't mean truly left media organizations. I use left and progressive differently, but you can, if you use them synonymously, that's not what I meant. Liberal publications will love her no matter what she says. And as an example of that,
they don't love her if she endorses Medicare for all.
Sure they would. They don't care what they just love her.
They
regardless.
bully every candidate into being a centrist.
Well, CBS News had a headline when Trump said the no taxing tipped wages thing that was like a move that could really hurt government revenue, or they had a shading of it that was negative. When she announced the same exact thing, you had no such shading. You can put them side by side, the two.
But it's not the
tweets.
same person saying these things. You can't compare apples to oranges when you think about these outlets. When I worked for the Bernie Sanders
It's a news reporter at the
campaign,
same outlets, though.
every candidate that supported Medicare for all, every candidate that talked about increasing the minimum wage, they were running ridiculous stories of economics that just doesn't make any sense, saying that this would somehow be bad for workers if we increase the minimum wage.
I think it would be
that
bad
somehow
for
it would be
workers.
bad for the economy and would reduce our quality of health care in the country if we made it more affordable. Whenever there's a candidate running on a policy platform that is progressive, that makes life better for working class people at the expense of corporate profits, they don't like that candidate.
All right, more Rising right after this. The Democratic National Convention is gearing up for protests when the convention kicks off next week in Chicago. The city is expecting thousands of pro-Palestinian protesters to descend on the city, but one pro-Israel nonprofit, the Israeli American Council, may not be able to stage their demonstration. The group told Jewish Insider, which first reported the story, that they submitted 2 applications with Chicago's Department of Transportation last month, but the group has not been given the go-ahead. Per the Jewish Insider, the city rejected the group's first request, citing a conflict with previously scheduled activity. IAC was given the option to rally at another park on the last night of the DNC, but it declined, saying it was too far from the convention center. Pro-Israel supporters are crying that there is a double standard. IAC CEO Elon Musk expressed outrage, posting on X, quote, "Disgraceful that Chicago is showing its bias in favor of anti-Israel groups by granting them a permit to march outside the DNC, but refusing to act on a similar permit application from IAC, the only pro-Israel group to apply." In an email, a spokesperson for the city, Erica Schroeder, told Rising that it supports the right to protest and, quote, "The political or other affiliation of a group is not a factor when reviewing permit applications. When a permit is denied, the applicant is given an alternative route per the requirements of city ordinance that allow the parade to proceed while accounting for police resources, security, safety, and other additional factors."
Meanwhile, the city is preparing for major pro-Palestine protests at the Democratic meeting. According to News Nation, the group March at the DNC 2024 will gather at Union Park, only a 10-minute walk from the convention center. The protesters say they want an immediate permanent ceasefire in Gaza and conditions on military aid to Israel. Policies which newly minted Democratic nominee Kamala Harris has yet to embrace. So it sounds like the pro-Palestine protesters put in their permits first. And so because they were in a designated area, this seems to me like an effort from the Chicago police to ensure these two groups, who are on opposing sides of a very emotional, heated conflict, from being in the same place. Because we've seen across the country, when counter-protesters show up and the police cannot establish a line between them, things have gotten violent. There's been fighting. There's been agitators who have gone into the encampment and just started tearing things down when protesters were camping out at UCLA. And so I really think this is an effort from law enforcement not to pick sides politically. I don't think the Chicago police are all pro-Palestine guys. I really think it's about them trying to make sure that there isn't a fight breaking out. I will also say the DNC is representing an administration that just gave $3.5 billion to Israel. So yes, those protesters are protesting the DNC. The pro-Israel protesters are protesting the protesters. So do they need to be close to the convention? They're not protesting the people inside. So if they want to decline their permit, that's fine. But I do think this was an action taken by the police to avoid violence.
Look, I don't know enough about the situation to really comment on it. I think that the rules need to be fair. If the Palestinian group applied first, and there's like a finite number of people that can be permitted in the space, then the rules are the rules. I mean, I do think the city and the police should absolutely facilitate the pro-Israel people being able to hold a demonstration to the same extent as the pro-Palestinian side. The police have an obligation to prevent violence, but the groups have to be, to some degree, allowed to hold demonstrations and counter demonstrations near each other, and then anybody who starts getting violent can get arrested for doing so on either side. So, I mean, it's like you can't, the mere fact that someone could commit violence is not, to my mind, sufficient reason to overcome the First Amendment obligation to allow people to demonstrate in public spaces near to the DNC. I mean, of course, the pro-Israel people want to be near to where the DNC is taking place because they want, they want to encourage the DNC to be more pro-Israel. They want to, show the DNC that there are pro-Israel Democrats and that they shouldn't cater to the pro-Palestinian side. And the pro-Palestinian people want to do the same thing, and they absolutely have the right to do so as well. I mean, the difficult situation is probably that the DNC does not want anyone protesting at all. They don't want these two very acrimonious groups, near their convention fighting with each other, because that's bad for optics. It makes it look like the Democratic coalition is not a coalition, is dysfunctional, there's a lot of internal disagreement over this issue, as there is. They want to, they want to not manifest what is the truth, is that there are a lot of people who disagree about the policy. So I see why they might leverage the city to say, can you just deny the second? They probably don't like that the pro-Palestinian one was granted, but there's nothing they can do about that. Like, maybe don't have the other people protesting so close so it doesn't become a big news story with people clashing. But the First Amendment doesn't care about what looks good or bad for the DNC, so they should be able to protest nearby.
I don't think the Chicago police are taking orders from the DNC, but I will say, Robbie,
I don't know if they are or not.
Questioning our freedom to protest. There's a lot of organizers who look at these protesters and say, why are you asking for permission from the government, which you are protesting, to protest? At that point, if you have a permit, that is just a parade. And so there needs to be some kind of actual standing up to the government for it to be a legitimate protest and not a parade, right? We're not protesting to make people feel at ease and staying out of their way. The protest intentionally is supposed to get people's attention. It makes people uncomfortable because the people in Gaza right now are the most uncomfortable people in the world because they're experiencing a genocide. That's what protests are supposed to do. So this idea that the permits determine where and if people are protesting is a little ridiculous.
I mean, I making the people in charge of government policy feel uncomfortable can be a valid tactic of protests. I agree. I think sometimes the protesters, maybe particularly leftist protesters, but just protesters of all kinds, mistake, the like throwing soup at things protesters that if we just make everyone uncomfortable, that will make our ideas more popular, which is a really inane idea. There's a difference between making the people in power, the people who can vote for policies, feel vulnerable in some way or feel that they are not popular, that they are targets, is a little bit different from making like ordinary everyday people who live in these cities feel, who are trying to get to work, feel who want to use the public spaces too, feel inconvenienced. That I don't think is at all productive, which is where the permitting process comes in. I mean, a public space, this is permissible under the First Amendment framework. A public space, there can be time, place, manner restrictions as long as they are ideologically neutral on who can use the space at what times. They can't discriminate in favor of one group or against one group for ideological reasons or, of course, race or gender-based reasons. But they can, you can, or else there would just be, or else the public spaces wouldn't be able to be used at all.
Yeah, I think there's definitely people who are protesting who are not making some kind of mental calculation. What is this going to have a positive strategic effect to have the world, or a world that looks similar to the one I want to see, where people are not genocided or the U.S. government doesn't support genocide? Is my action going to work towards that ends? I think a lot of people, their activism is just emoting because it doesn't have that impact on people in power. But I think there are some good strategic organizers probably behind this. But I think this push to get permits so that people don't get mass arrested is silly. There's always people who are showing up to these events willing to get arrested, and we don't really have a right to protest if we only do it when the police says okie dokie.
More Rising right after this. Algerian Olympic boxing champion Imane Khelif is looking to knock down a few more people. The fighter filed a lawsuit against Elon Musk, J.K. Rowling, and others, including Donald Trump, for aggravated cyber harassment. Now, Khelif came under scrutiny during the Olympics after a swarm of accusations were thrown her way, questioning her gender. According to Variety magazine, Khelif's attorney, Nabil Boudi, filed a complaint with the Paris prosecutor's office on Friday, naming both the tech billionaire and famed author. Their names were posted on the prosecution's anti-online hatred center. The prosecutor's office did confirm to Variety that an investigation has been launched to, quote, conduct an investigation into the counts of cyber harassment due to gender, public insult because of gender, public incitement to discrimination, and public insult because of origin.
At the heart of the complaint are visceral comments that Musk, Rowling, and others made about Khelif, questioning her sex. Khelif, who was born a female and does not identify as intersex or transgender. Most attacks about her were made on social media, particularly X. Booty says that the hope in an investigation the hope is that the investigation will land in court, in which case the subject will have to stand trial. So it is true that in October of 2023, J.K. Rowling posted on X saying, I'll happily do 2 years if the alternative is compelled speech and forced denial of the reality and importance of sex. So she has said she's willing to do time for this, for pronouns.
Yeah, which I think would be an absolute travesty of free speech. Look, you cannot like what Rowling or Elon or anyone else said about this boxer, who I understand and we've, explained many times, is not transgender, was born with female sex organs, although there is some controversy because she also possesses or was found in one of the checks by the International Boxing Association to have some male sex characteristics and was not qualified under those rules. The Olympic has different rules and allowed her to compete. So the bottom line being, I think it would be insane to criminalize having that debate at all, or having people be allowed to comment on that. If something was said that was false and was libelous, then you can sue someone for libel under U.S. law. Obviously, that doesn't really apply here. The idea that there's some online cyberbullying harassment office where you can lob complaints that people said something that offended you, that itself offends me. I won't take my complaint to any online resource center, but I think it's a very slippery slope here. Yeah,
it's interesting that the initial claims about Khelif's gender came from the IBA, which is controlled largely by Russian oligarchs, and they claimed to do these tests right after she defeated a well-known Russian boxer, and people believe this to be retaliatory. They've been riddled with corruption at the International Boxing Association. Now they're permanently banned from being involved in the Olympics at all. So it's kind of sad that a news story that came out of that ended up producing this. They haven't released what biochemical tests were done or any evidence that she failed some kind of gender test. And so I think that's really sad that that's the source of this. These are the same people that if someone looks like a man or takes hormones and therefore is transgender, but they were born with female sex organs, that they'll say, you're not a man, you'll never be a man, you're a woman. But when it's Khelif, somehow that doesn't apply. She was a female at birth, but now they're saying she's a man when she's always been a woman. And so I think it just shows the hypocrisy there, and that maybe there's some acknowledgement or learning going on that is uncomfortable for them, that there's more complexities to gender identity than just sex assigned at birth.
Well, there's also, there are a lot of very specific rules in sports and in boxing for who can compete against who under what conditions, right? You have to be in a certain weight class, you have to weigh in and make sure you're still fighting against the people you're sanctioned to fight against. So I think the idea that it would be impossible that this person was not right for this fight is wrong. Now, you could be correct that the Russian one was motivated, and I don't want to bring any harassment or abuse on this woman. She was qualified under the Olympics rules, and she won the fight, and the other fighter said that she didn't mean to make it about gender or anything else and would fight her again, and so it seems to me that the issue should be over and done with. But look, you have to, I believe in the right to be wrong on the internet, to not criminalize speech just because it is wrong or mistaken, and that's what's underway here. I find that very worrisome.
Yeah, I think that there is a different
investigate people for
body.
Wrong speech?
Yeah, who was spreading this claim by the IBA that doesn't have any evidence to support it? Are they culpable? Because it seems to me that Elon Musk, J.K. Rowling, well, they have big platforms and they should be responsible with them. That them and others online were the victims of misinformation, right? They believed this story that Khelif has XY chromosomes, which is not a test that was ever done, but something that was reported on. They said things about her testosterone levels and whether or not she was born a woman. All of these things are untrue. All of these things are harmful. But
the testosterone, she had failed a testosterone test according to this other standard that you're arguing might have been incorrect.
They said it was not a testosterone test. They said it was a different biochemical test and never released the results of it, but they did say it wasn't testosterone. And so I have a lot of questions about if a test was actually done.
Yeah, I think we should be allowed to have questions.
Yeah. And without that evidence there, people, weren't reading into it. They weren't searching for the source of this. They read the news story, believed it to be true, and then they posted this. So if they're found guilty of something here, I think that would be a bit of a stretch for the law to go that far and say that they were willfully, defaming her and saying hateful things and discriminating against her because of her gender. I think it would be smart for some of the defendants on this case to be the people who originally reported on this and pushed this idea.
Well, if they were just legitimately a mistake, again, the way to correct these things is the follow-up reporting that is being done by news outlets and being done online, the record being set straight. It can be self-correcting. We don't need some bureaucratic entity to bring cyber-bullying charges. It's a very nebulous term anyway, especially for public people. Is there no right to criticize, even in very evocative, provocative, hateful language, public figures and personalities? I think there should be. Some people, sometimes they deserve, what, Donald Trump? Can he say, I'm being cyberbullied because people are being mean to me? We don't want to live in that world. That'd be very silly.
I think there's a world where she lost sponsorships because of this. Algeria is a country that is, very anti-LGBTQ+, very anti-transgender specifically. And so there is a case to be made for this story being pushed, causing her some kind of financial harm. I'm sure they would have to prove in a court of law that the people who spread this message willingly spread it, knowing that it was harmful or false.
Well, that does it for us today on Rising. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow with our Thursday show. In the meantime, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. See you tomorrow.
Bye, y'all.